Hello. Welcome to Season XV of the Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. In each episode, we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season, we're watching movies from the 90s and talking about how they fit into the larger picture of 90s horror and how each year from that decade stacks up against the others. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the episode. All right, here we are kicking off the first official episode of Season XV, which is our tour through horror movies of the 90s with some caveats. We're not doing any sequels or remakes, and we're not doing anything with a budget of over $100 million, and we're not doing anything that we've done before. So, fresh, new content.
No one can see this because we're only on voice, but I'm air playing guitar. I'm playing air guitar right now. Like, I'm rocking hard, too. That's how excited I am for this episode.
I'm giving you like a Bon Jovi fist bump, like fist in the air. Like, yeah.
Like, legit, if you guys listen to the intro, you might hear me. I was legit strumming on my belly, and I was like, oh, the mic's picking that up. I'm excited, man. I'm just glad to be back in the saddle. We're back on movies. You know, we don't going through the TV shows like we did last season. We're in the 90s. I mean, it's just going to be a good decade, dude.
Yeah, and I feel very refreshed after our much needed break from season the 13th. Yeah. So, yeah, back in the saddle, ready to rock and roll. Yes, this week, we are doing our first episode of a movie from 1990. We'll do another movie from 1990 next week, and then we'll move on to 1991 after that, and so on. But before we get into the movie we're reviewing today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some movies that were not eligible. So these are movies from 1990 that, because of our rules, we could not talk about today. And there are some real gems in here, so try to contain your disappointment. Today we are not talking about Predator 2, Child's Play 2, Troll 2, Basket Case 2, Night of the Living Dead, the remake, Gremlins 2, the new batch, Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, The Exorcist 3, or Silent Night, Deadly Night 4. What
the hell were you even supposed to record for 1990? That's what I need to know. That is a
truly amazing number of sequels to all come out in the same year. Yeah. Is that not crazy? Like, I mean, I guess now it's similar, like, with if you think about all the Marvel stuff and so on, but wow.
It's insane if you think, that's like, that sets the stage, I feel like. I don't know this for sure, but going into this decade, I feel like that's just, it's either leftovers or it just sets the stage of what we have to expect.
Yeah. And then we also have already covered It, the made-for-TV one from 1990, so we're not going to talk about that either. Yeah. But that is something that we'll take into consideration when we do our final rankings of how the different years of the 90s stack up to each other film-wise. So, the movie we are going to talk about today was called Jacob's Ladder. And this one had been on my list for a while because when we were researching season 14 and looking at horror movies that had a Twilight Zone episode as like a pretty obvious influence, this is one that came up a lot with regard to the episode An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Mm-hmm. And so I went back and watched that one sort of in preparation for watching this movie. And it was funny because the thing that was similar in them didn't come until the very end. Like, they were very, very different until like a thing that happens at the end of the episode and at the end of the movie. Yeah. So that was kind of funny to me because I'd read all these articles, and as I'm watching this movie, you know, I'm like 80% of the way through, and I'm like, what the hell were they talking about? But I get it now.
You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah, I'm not
just watching a random episode.
Yeah.
Turns out his name was just Jacob the whole time. That's
it. Did you know anything at all about this movie?
I knew zero.
Same.
About this.
Yeah, I had no awareness of it whatsoever until I read about it in some of the articles about Twilight Zone influences. So I was quite pleasantly surprised to see a young Ving Rhames and Jason Alexander and Macaulay Culkin in this one. I mean, they had some real all-stars.
Tim Robbins.
Oh, yeah, and Tim Robbins. But I guess he was young too. But yeah.
Yeah, I've heard, now I've heard this movie referenced a ton. There's an episode of Twilight Zone that I watched a long time. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. But like, I legit have heard it referenced. I assume it came from The Simpsons, if I'm just being honest with everyone.
That's probably, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a fair assessment. But no, when you said that was the one that we're doing, like, I had like a legit excitement.
Yeah.
Now, do we also tell them the ones we decide not to pick? Or we leave that for surprise for future?
We can maybe we can do that next week when we do the other.
Okay, yeah, that's
okay.
I was torn on one, but since I picked the next one, so we'll do that next week. You're right.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and like I said, this one had been high on my list for a while just because it came up when reading about other things, but I really didn't know what to expect from it, so I went in pretty open. But before we get into that, I'll do a quick introduction, and then we can get into the Tim Robbins is a good foot taller than all the other actors details.
It's fucking back, dude. Oh, yeah. Air guitar.
In 1990, TriStar Pictures brought us Jacob's Ladder, a psychological horror film starring Tim Robbins. This movie tells the story of a Vietnam veteran who starts having mental issues and is increasingly unable to separate memories of his past from his present. This movie was made on a budget of $25 million and made about $26 million at the box office. In later years, it gained a reputation as a cult hit, and a remake was released in 2019. The original can currently be rented for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. So this movie started off very Vietnam-y. Like, it really reminded me a lot of like The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now, like stuff in sort of that just like gritty, dark Vietnam was horrific and scarring type movie making.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that being that we're in the 90s, it makes sense because the people who were making the films more than likely, well, they lived through it, Vietnam. Now those guys are older, so it's like it's pretty true to form, and I feel like we got a lot of 90s Vietnam films. But yeah, this one was like it. It's funny you say Deer Hunter because it 1000%. That's all I could think of for any Vietnam piece. I don't know why. That's not even my favorite Vietnam War film.
Well, it just had kind of that like gritty, like psychologically heavy feel to it, which I feel like this one did too. It was very much in that same vein.
Yeah.
And that opening scene was just gnarly. I mean, with all the... So it's like you have this group of soldiers that are getting attacked by an unseen enemy, but also they're having these like weird physical symptoms, like a really bad headache or vomiting or bleeding from the mouth. And then, things are blowing up and one guy gets away into the jungle and then gets stabbed by a bayonet. Like, it was just a harsh, nasty, uncomfortable intro.
Yeah. It set the stage for what to expect throughout the rest of the film.
Yeah. And going back to it, like having understood the full story now, there were parts in that are a lot more meaningful than I realized at the time. But it was just when you're just dropped in and that's what you're experiencing with no frame of reference, it was just like chaos and agony,
Yeah. And like trying to figure, like it's strange being dropped in to something like that because like you don't know, like what you said, you don't really know what you should be retaining, what you shouldn't be. And like part of me, thinks it's maybe a little cheap to drop in important things beginning when things are just balls to the wall. But the other side is just like, just chill out and accept it. And it was good, like it ended up good. So why, why's that a problem? But Yeah, I couldn't. Like, I feel like just, especially with how much we know about the Vietnam War now, like, that's just horrific in itself. That, like, when I started watching this and, like, I knew it was about Vietnam going into it, I was just like, I don't know. It just made it, I guess, even more intense. Like, it's like, oh, that's a good idea, since it's already in a terrible. It's like basically making a horror film in hell. You know what I mean? Like, that's a good stage to start a horror film, because it's scary and shitty, and so it made sense. The math checked out, I guess, is what I'm saying with this one.
Yeah, and I think it was really effective to use that, like, time period and location and imagery with the way that they made the movie. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of it was him just kind of like walking around being confused in the present. Yeah. And then it would cut into either like he'd have these flashbacks, or there would be some kind of action thing where something like trippy happens and he's not sure how to make sense of it. And just from a directing perspective, there were a lot of hard cuts between scenes that were very abrupt. And one of those that stood out to me early on was when the chiropractor is adjusting his neck, and then all of a sudden he's just back in the jungle. Yeah. And I did not see that coming. And to be immediately thrown back into that environment after they'd already sort of traumatized you with it in the opening was a pretty effective way to kind of keep that tension and that kind of dread that comes with a good psychological horror movie going.
Yeah. And, true to psychological horror, like it definitely, like, I think with that chiropractor scene, it was like, oh, that's the moment where I was like, oh, that's what we were in for this episode, like, or for this movie. We don't know what's real, what's not real, what's being imagined, I just said what's real, what's not real, and then said something that's not real again. So sorry about that. But we have watched movies like that in the past where you're like, where it does, like, I think that the goal was to kind of for the viewer to not be able to know what's real and not real, especially pertaining to what the content of the film. And it was successful, in my opinion, really well. Because I was confused a lot of it, like, not confused, but just like, what is this, a flashback? Is this, like that kind of thing, the whole film.
Right. And I think that was definitely the point. I mean, like, that was kind of the way that the movie makers were messing with you in this one. And, you said, like, not real versus imagined. I can see that coming into play in that we didn't know how much of it was like there is some malevolent force out there who's after him versus it's all in his head and this is just PTSD that's untreated and like mental illness that's getting out of hand. Yeah. So it was like he didn't know what was going on, but also you as the viewer feel equally confused. And I think that's a really effective way of kind of creating the feelings that horror movies need to create across the duration of the movie.
Yeah, it's a good way. I mean, it's another way of putting you in the shoes of the killer, in so to speak. Like you're basically putting. It's a good way to put yourself in the main character's eyes, I guess. Like the viewers are going along with him because he didn't know what was going on either, and we sure as shit didn't. So it just kind of it really worked out, and I thought there was a really good balance with it too, like the flashbacks and what's real, what's not real.
It definitely kept you on your toes. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the whole time you kind of had a feeling that it was all headed towards some kind of resolution too. Like they did enough foreshadowing that you kind of knew there was going to be a grand reveal at the end.
Oh yeah.
And so that kept you interested in the story and wanting to see how it played out. It didn't feel like it was all just completely random and you were never going to get any answers like some movies.
Yeah. Yeah. If they, that I would have refused to record this episode if they did without, like, that was a ride that we were on. But.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have any like favorite scenes in this one?
Oh man. I'll let you go first. Did you have any favorite scenes?
I did. One that I thought was really effective, that because we've talked about this before, when we're watching these movies, there's always slow parts. And so it's really easy to start like reading about the movie or like read about, you know, how tall Tim Robbins is or something like that, as opposed to like paying super close attention. And with this one, there was the scene where he's like at the dance party and then he's hallucinating and then he falls to the floor screaming and he has this flashback of being found in the jungle, but then they're back in the apartment building and he's running a fever that's really high. And so the girlfriend gets the neighbors to help hold him down in a bathtub and fill it with ice to try and get his temperature down. And it's just this super intense, super loud, kind of fast moving scene. And then it's like all of a sudden that just stops and he wakes up in bed and it's like he's back in his old life from before the war. Oh, yeah. And so like all that loss that he'd been dealing with and everything, it was just like gone. And he wakes up and he's talking to his wife about how he was having a bad dream about living with, you know, one of his coworkers from the post office. And then his kid comes in and isn't really dead. And the way that that was presented differently than all the flashbacks was really interesting to me, because I honestly did not know if he was waking up from a bad dream and this is just what the movie was going to be the rest of the time, or if this was just a different type of like mental state that he'd gotten into where he's not able to even tell like where he is in time and space. Yeah. And just that kind of sinking feeling of all that loss and regret that he had might have just been like part of a fever dream, or he might be experiencing something as real and about to lose it all over again. I thought it was just like mind blowing from a let's create a thing that will really mess with your brain type experience.
Yeah, because that scene, right? I mean, just in itself. Oh man, yeah, where he finally gets back home, it just kills you. Yeah, especially content. I think if I had to pick like a favorite scene, I'll stick to more like a horror, but so like after Jesse tells him that the lawyer's not taken, okay, so technically it's after, but when he's admitted to the hospital, so the scene where like the evil doctor where Jesse is like the nurse as well, like that whole scene, I want to say it was the most horrific for me, one of the most horrific for the film. However, it's definitely tied because it really reminded me of the doctor scene in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which tripped me out when I was a kid. And so like I was legit like still holding on to that. I was like, this is insane. But yeah, that's where like the evil doctor's gonna operate on him, tells him he's dead. He insists he's not and that he's alive, and then that's when the doctor punctures the forehead with a needle to reach his brain. Just
gnarly.
Yeah. So that was probably what I would consider most intense. However, I want to say like this whole film had like bits and pieces just added throughout it that was pretty crazy, pretty intense, I would say.
There was also that. I was going to say there was also that scene that I don't think was that much later, where his wife and kids show up to see him in the hospital, and he's just like really out of it. And the wife says, "I still love you," and then you just hear someone whisper, "Dream on." Yeah. That was like soul crushing, like just oh man, like, and it was such a subtle thing, but the way that they would bring in like new manifestations of things, like it escalated. It wasn't just like, a single. It wasn't like he just only had flashbacks the whole movie. There was like also that distorted reality that was being very like personalized to make life terrible for him. Yeah, that it was just crushing. I mean, it felt like a very, very heavy movie, kind of, and that's the same way I felt with The Deer Hunter.
Yeah, and I will say I also had the same feeling with The Exorcist too. Watching.
Oh, like, I can see that.
I guess the feeling of like something's weird that's going on here.
Yeah.
And like we're still kind of figuring out kind of thing, but I don't want to be here. I feel like that was, kind of priest and exorcist and Jacob in this, but like just the unwanted and the torture that came from everything that he was dealing with. Like he was just, I felt like the whole thing, he was just tortured. The whole movie, Jacob was just straight up tortured.
Yeah. Yeah. It was heavy. Crazy. I mean, this was not a fun movie. This, I have to think, was not the same viewing experience as Gremlins 2: The New Batch. Which also came out in 1990.
Definitely intense. But all of that doesn't mean, like, I'll recommend someone to watch this, like, like in the future for sure. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it was exhausting watching it.
This is what you want out of a psychological horror movie.
1,000%.
I mean, it really, I think, did everything that a good psychological horror movie does, and did it very well.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Like, this is one of, like, the definitions. And I don't think I'm the biggest psychological horror fan out there, because I don't get it, because, I don't relate with people. But this one, I was like, shit. I didn't relate with them either, but still.
I think psychological horror a lot of times mixes really well with other types. I feel like when a movie tries to be just like psychological horror the whole time, sometimes there tends to be really long, boring sections.
Yeah.
But like I said, just the way this one was made, I feel like was really good. And the way the story developed and the way that the directing sort of reinforced it, I really was impressed by. And this is just, I think, a great way to start the season. But I did have one final question for you.
Yeah.
What did you think of the ending? He was dead the whole time.
I think it was a better ending than Sixth Sense. No, I'm just kidding. I've never seen it. Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, that almost had to be like the most logical. Like, if they come back and be like, it was just the ladder, the medicine the whole time, that's why you're acting this. Like, I don't think I think I would have been frustrated, pretty angry at like all the stuff I watched before. Because that would tell me that there was ulterior motives, like why he's not with his wife and why, his son's not a lot, all that. I mean, I think it was like sufficient, I guess is the best way, like better than expected, but because my expectations were a little low, because the other thing with psychological horror is that's the title that like non-horror films get the most. Well, it's like, well, it does go through some mental torture here, and it's like, yeah, but that's just a drama that you're watching. But anyway,
give me the real torture.
Yeah. I think it was like, I think that because they put together the film well enough, like throughout the majority of it, and there was a lot of pieces that they added, like where were the rest of his, what about the rest of his troops or company or whatever? Being that they had that, and then when you kind of see like towards the end, like who was the one who had stabbed him to kill him. Yeah, it was intense, albeit confusing.
Yeah, and
I won't
going
say
back,
that this is easy to understand film. I feel like it was a little difficult at points.
It took me a while to kind of put it all together, and like going back through my notes helped. But basically, I think the whole movie was like a depiction of hell as your inability to let go of the stuff that had you anchored to your life, which is kind of a weird take, and I don't know how well that message lands with it, but I still think it was a good, scary movie.
Yeah, he's already dead. It's like all he could have done is, And then the thing they threw in at the end, I don't know. It didn't need it, I guess.
Which part?
Like where they're like, BZ was tested on troops in Vietnam War.
Oh,
whatever. You know, that whole thing. I was just like, don't get me wrong, I get it. But like, that's what this was about the whole time. can't we just say we made a good psychological horror film and just be happy with that?
Yeah, well, I think the whole like investigation into it was a thing that kind of kept him moving forward from a plot perspective, and so it was useful, to like have a thing for him to be doing and more to add to the mystery. But
the ending piece was just it was just like the real life. What happened in real life though is what I'm saying. Like sure, I get his pieces, but
but so spoiler warning. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, the Twilight Zone episode, also ends with a guy having had a delusion about escaping death in his like last few moments of life. And then you find out at the very end of the episode that he basically was dead the whole time. And then it also made me think of the episode that we reviewed in season 14, episode 2, which was a Twilight Zone episode called Perchance to Dream, where the guy has the whole experience of the episode when really you find out he laid down to sleep and died basically as soon as he got into the doctor's office. So a couple of Twilight Zone influences in this one, which make it a really nice bridge from season 14 to season XV.
I concur.
Starting off strong. I like it.
Yeah, no, that was a good pick, man, for sure.
I was pleasantly surprised. And I am looking forward to coming back next week and doing your choice from 1990, which was Arachnophobia.
Oh, shit my pants watching this film, man. Not because I'm scared of spiders, but because I got shit. Just kidding.
The scariest thing about arachnophobia is that I typed it probably 100 times in my notes and still cannot spell it correctly consistently.
I didn't even think about that, but I'm going to have to title the next episode for when we record. But I'm definitely not spelling it right. That's for science right there, man. That's not happening.
There's always too many A's, not enough O's.
Mm-hmm.
Well, cool. We did it. We're back. We'll be back again next week.
I say the outro should just be me air guitaring it for about 5 minutes.
Perfect.
Play Star Spangled Banner right now to start it off, just so everyone
my hand is over my heart. I knew exactly what you were doing.
You don't start air guitar without playing Star Spangled Banner first. That's science.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com.
Or hit us up on the IG. That's what the kids call Instagram.
Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.